I've been a huge fan of Dom Perignon Champagne for many years. With extended bottle aging, it's provided some of my favorite all-time champagne experiences. So it's always an exciting time when a new vintage of Dom Perignon is released. On this channel, I've reviewed every vintage of Dom Perignon since the 2010 came out. Last night, I was fortunate to get my hands on some of the 2015 Dom Perignon, which is launching soon. I'm pretty sure I'm the first person in the great state of Texas to get a bottle. So in this video, I'm going to pop this bottle, taste the champagne, and let you know my thoughts regarding the 2015 Dom Perignon. And be sure to stick around to the end, as I'll be providing my thoughts regarding wine collecting strategies generally for Dom Perignon, as well as whether or not I think you should buy the 2015 vintage. But first, some quick background information. Unlike some other champagne houses, Dom Perignon only produces vintage champagne. They don't release a vintage every year. So for example, they skipped 2011 and 2014, and it's my understanding that after this 2015 release, they won't release another vintage until 2017. Every vintage of Dom Perignon is going to taste a little bit different. This is so because Dom tries to express not just its house style, but also the character of each vintage in every release. Those who are new to Dom Perignon may wonder why the 2015 is just being released now. Well, this is so because every bottle of Dom Perignon has to age for at least 8 years before it's released. During this extended lees aging, the Dom Perignon will develop complexity as well as autolytic flavors and aromas, such as toast, bread, brioche, and almonds. This extended lees aging is also very expensive, and one reason that Dom Perignon costs what it does. The flavor profile for each vintage of Dom Perignon is heavily influenced by the weather. In 2015, there was a cold spring, but after that, it was hot and dry for the rest of the growing season. This heat helped to provide some generosity to the fruit, so the 2015 vintage has a little bit more of a fruit-forward nature than many vintages of Dom Perignon. For the most part, champagne is made from Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Meunier, either individually or in any combination. But Dom Perignon uses only Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in its blend. This distinguishes it from some other champagne houses like Krug, which uses Meunier in its blend as well as Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Most of the time, Dom Perignon is a pretty even mix between Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. The 2015 vintage was 51% Pinot Noir and 49% Chardonnay, which is the same mix as in 2012 and 2013. The dosage for the 2015 Dom Perignon is 4.5 grams per liter. Enough with the small talk, now it's time to taste the 2015 Dom Perignon and for me to give you my thoughts. This one does have some vibrant, impressive fruit. I immediately get descriptors such as lime, lemon, hints of mandarin. There's a bitterness, I would say grapefruit, but there's also some fruits such as peach and nectarine. I'm also getting some floral notes, like blossom, jasmine. There's definitely a spicy component, white pepper, perhaps some cardamom, maybe even a little bit of cocoa. As I expected, I'm also getting some autolytic notes like bread, toast, brioche. There's definitely an intriguing texture to this wine. It's really expanding on the palate with waves of flavor. The finish is really incredibly long and complex. With Chateau d'Yquem, they always say that it spreads like a peacock's tail, and I get that impression with this 2015 Dom Perignon as well. It really coats your palate thoroughly, and it lingers for a long time. There's definitely a mineral quality to it, perhaps some wet stone or gravel or chalk. It's really an intriguing champagne. I'm definitely a fan of it. When a new release of Dom Perignon comes out, I always try to compare it to a previous vintage, but this one is really difficult to place. To some extent, it has a little bit of 2009 in that the fruit is vibrant and prominent, but it definitely has more depth and a little more restraint than that 2009 vintage, which I often call Dom in a bikini just because it's so flamboyant. The Cellar Master compares it to 2003, and while I see that to some extent, From what I recall, when I tried the 2003 vintage on release, the fruit was a little more restrained and the acid profile was definitely more prominent than this 2015. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. With Dom Perignon, you sometimes hear about the Plitudes as well. And that's just a word that Dom Perignon uses to describe the stage of evolution of a champagne. Plenitude 1 is the release stage, what 2015 is in right now. At this stage, the champagne will be characterized by youthful fruit, creamy texture, and it will have some complexity, but not as much complexity as it will have at the Plenitude 2 or Plenitude 3 stage. Plenitude 2 is typically about 20 years after the vintage, and Plenitude 3 is typically 30 to 40 years after the vintage. Some of you may also wonder why I'm not drinking this champagne out of a flute. Well, the reason for that is whenever I drink proper champagne, I always like to drink it out of a glass that has a little bit of a wider rim, and a flute is so narrow that it really doesn't allow you to appreciate the aromatics of a high-quality champagne. By the same token, I don't like coupes either, because that tends to oxidize the champagne too quickly, and it will lose its freshness faster than it should. For those interested in collecting Dom Perignon, my advice is to buy in quantity on release and then to age it yourself. If you buy it with age in the secondary market, provenance can be questionable, and if you buy directly from the champagne house, you won't have a problem with provenance, but you will pay a lot more for those bottles. So definitely the most cost-effective way is to buy them on release and age them yourself. I've been doing that since the 1995 release of Dom Perignon, and it works great. You also may want to consider buying some magnums. As Winston Churchill said, a magnum is the perfect size of champagne for two gentlemen to enjoy over lunch, especially if one of them is not drinking. While there can be a bit of a premium for magnums of champagne, it tends to be worth it, especially if you plan to age the champagne for a long period of time, as it helps the champagne stay incredibly fresh and vibrant, even with decades of age on it. I remember a couple years ago, for example, I opened a 1983 Magnum of Dom Perignon, and it was still incredibly fresh and vibrant. A couple weeks later, we had a standard release of the Dom Perignon from 1983, and that one definitely seemed to be past peak. So size definitely does matter when it comes to aged champagne. Vintage is definitely important when it comes to collecting Dom Perignon as well. In strong vintages, such as 2008 and 2012, I tend to buy at least double or triple my typical allocation of Dom Perignon. In other vintages, I'll just buy my standard amount, such as 6 bottles or so. With respect to the 2015 vintage, it looks like the average price in the United States on Wine Searcher is around $260 on pre-release, and I have seen some wide variations, however, with some places selling it for much more than $300 a bottle. So with Dom Perignon, there's always substantial price variation, and it always pays off to shop around. If you're a fan of Dom Perignon, I would definitely recommend buying the 2015 vintage, but I'd probably just buy my standard allocation rather than a premium quantity. There's still plenty of 2013 Dom Perignon on store shelves as well, and that vintage is undoubtedly going to be available for less than the 2015 vintage. So if you're considering purchasing the 2013 vintage of Dom Perignon, be sure to check out this video as well.